what does he link it with?
Greed, which is idolatry.
He links it with greed. What kind of sexuality is he talking about here? He's talking about a sexuality that is consumptive. It's part of a consumer society, right? That sexuality which doesn't occur in a context of committed, trothful, covenant relationships, but that's all about using someone else for your own pleasure. And don't forget, he's writing this in, Colossians is written fairly late. Nero was this incredibly immoral, sexually immoral ruler who made it okay to just be incredibly sexually abusive towards other people. And in that kind of a context, and the upper class followed his example. And in that kind of a context, he's writing, you know what? The story of the empire, which results in this incredible kind of sexuality which just uses people. Don't have any of that, because that's no difference than the economics of the empire, which just uses people, right? It's greed. That's what it is, and it's all rooted in idolatry. Okay. That's why. So he's not saying sex is bad. He's saying this kind of imperial sexuality, that's bad. I mean, really, you don't have to go too far in our culture to see what the parallel is, right? I mean, we live in a culture of consumptive sexuality where everything is objectified, and everything is sold using sex.
And I think that's interesting, because it says, and greed, which is idolatry. So it's this economic kind of a sin, greed. Mm-hmm. And so it's, I often hear Christians talk about, we make a god out of sexuality. I'm not sure we make a god out of sexuality. I think we make a god out of consumption. And that becomes the idolatry. And so then if you live an idolatrous, consumptive life, then a sexually promiscuous life makes total sense.
Yeah, because it just fits in with how you consume everything else.
It'd be pretty crazy if Christians were consumptive in all the other dimensions of their lives. But they would say, don't be consumptive in your sexuality. Well, why not? If I'm already an idolater in the way in which I live my economic life, in the way in which I do my investments, in the way in which I buy my products, if I'm already an idolater there, why not be an idolater with my reproductive organs too? It seems that Paul would say, no idolatry throughout the whole of your life.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and then this stuff about, all such things that you need to get rid of. Verse 8, chapter 3. Anger, wrath, malice, slander. Mark Rock would probably say wrath, wouldn't he?
Probably.
Yeah. I can't do it. I don't know why. And abusive language. Do not lie to one another. I mean, at the heart of the imperial story is the kind of misnaming of the way things are. And this false story and these lies and the kind of anger and malice and slander that tears the community apart, right? Paul is saying that's not the kind of community you're called to be. These are communal sins he's talking about here. It's not personal.
And wasn't there a place, wasn't there a Briton who said something about the Romans did this and they called it that? What was that quote I heard?
Tacitus writes about that the Romans make a desolation and they call it peace.
Make a desolation and call it peace.
That's exactly it. So there's this...
That's abusive language.
That's what it is.
Calling something peace that's a desolation is abusive language. Calling a war for the liberation of people so they can be democratic when that isn't really what it's about, I guess that's deceitful language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's abusive language. It's like swearing in the schoolyard, only worse.
So naming it occupation, which is what the papers on the other side of the world talk about.
Yes. That's a different way of naming
that's
something.
That's freeing the abusive language from that story. So then you've got this renewal, and it all comes back to being renewed in knowledge according to the image of the Creator. Verse 10. We got that image stuff again. And what does that look like? Well, it looks like a renewal where there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. So that fact that Jesus all things, remember that in 1:15 to 20 you have all things are created through him and all things are for him and all things are reconciled. That means that all being in Christ means all the barriers are gone. Whether you're Jew or Greek, whether you're, a barbarian, a Scythian is like a terrorist, right? Way out on the edge. Nobody's a terrorist anymore. We don't make those distinctions. Neither slave nor free. So what does this mean, that Jesus is the one through whom everything is created? It means that all these barriers that the society has set up, all the barriers that say, well, this person's not as good as this person, and this person's better than this person, and this person's money makes them better than that person, that's all gone. We're not going to make those kind of distinctions anymore. And so you've got this incredible picture of a community that's rejected all of that hierarchy. The empire, has its person in control. That's only maintained by a whole hierarchy underneath there.
Yeah.
It's gone. It's all gone.
Because Christ is all and in all.
That's right.
And because Christ is in all and in all, is all and in all, then the image of God, back to Genesis, the image of God is now renewed so people can be what they're always called to be. Then he goes on with this list of, their virtues, right? And at this point, I guess, this is where it becomes really personal, because he's now talking about personal kinds of virtues and how we as what?
No, it's not personal. There's nothing personal about this letter.
What do you mean it's not personal?
Well, it's just not personal. Look at those virtues. Compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience.
Yeah, that's all. Those are personal virtues.
Well, they're not just personal virtues. It would be nice. You can't be compassionate by yourself. Right?
Yeah.
This is about how you comport your life in everything. Right? These are economic virtues. They're political virtues. They're environmental virtues. Just ask yourself. Paul has just been talking about how there's no slave and free, these are economic categories, right? Slaves are your biggest economic assets. And he's saying, no, you're to be clothed with compassion. Well, what does it look like to live a compassionate economic life?
I guess that would be an economic life that actually prioritizes the slave.
Exactly. It's an economic life that prioritizes the most vulnerable. It's a political virtue, right? If you want to live an economic life that prioritizes the most vulnerable, which I think is what compassion would probably do, then maybe politically you're going to have to try to work for laws that give priority to those who are the most vulnerable. Those would be compassionate laws. Or kindness, right? What would be economic kindness? Or kindness as a political virtue? Probably isn't 48 days detention or 42 days detention, is it?
I don't know.
Humility. What's a humility as an economic virtue or as a political virtue?
Well, humility, that's a tough one because, you don't get ahead in the world without thinking you're pretty darn good and without projecting that you're pretty good. Arrogance seems to be at the heart of success in the empire.
Right. And Paul is saying,
that's not what this story leads us to.
No, and it might be saying that as a politician or as a political party, you are saying, well, we don't have all the answers. We need to learn from this ethnic group and this group and this group here because they have something to teach us about how we do politics in our country. Or they have something to teach us about how we do economics. Maybe that's what humility... humility is an interesting one if you think about it as an environmental virtue. It means we don't assume we have mastery over creation and we know how everything works. It means that we say, maybe we don't know it all and we need to learn from these plants and from these animals how we interact with them. Maybe there are things to be learned.
That leads to both meekness and patience because that kind of learning, ecological learning, is a long haul kind of thing. It requires incredible patience, and it also requires I think a meekness, because a meekness suggests to me an openness, right? An openness that